Before watching this uh, PowerPoint presentation along with my commentary, be sure and watch the entirety of the Sensation and Perception video clip from the Discovering Psychology series that is narrated by Dr. Philip Zimbardo at Stanford University. Once you've watched that, then return to this and watch this from the beginning. One of the things that we might talk about right away is what is the difference between sensation and perception? And why should psychologists study sensation and perception anyway? Well, as I'm sure you gathered from the video clip, sensation is basically what happens in your sensory receptors for your eyes, your ears, your tongue, your nose, your touch, all those kinds of things. But perception is your brain's interpretation of all of those sensations. We can all watch the same movie, for example, and when it's over, have totally different perceptions that result. Consequently, psychologists are very interested in studying sensation and perception. Quite often, people who are experiencing psychological difficulties are having a tendency to interpret sensations differently than people who are not experiencing trauma. For example, when I was a school psychologist at Austin High years ago, there was a student who was going to see the counselor and saying that students were laughing at her and talking about her when she walked down the halls. She was new to the school and she felt like she was being ridiculed and rejected and that sort of thing. When in fact, I'm not sure anyone was even noticing her. So students tended to gather and they might have been talking about anything. And when she walked by, if they were laughing, she thought they were laughing at her. Whereas other people walking by that same group of students that heard them laughing did not interpret them as laughing at them. So it's important to study sensation and perception. One of the things that is also mentioned in your textbook as well as in the video is a concept known as visual capture. And that is the tendency for vision to dominate the other four senses. It's kind of interesting. Over the years, I've counseled many visually impaired individuals, as well as had visually impaired students in my classes. And if, let's say, they're coming into my office to talk about things, and I might say to them, "Hey, it's great to see you today," you'd be amazed at how many of the completely blind students will say to me, "Hey, it's great to see you too." Or if I would be walking down the hall on campus and I would see a student in my class, I might call them by name and say, "Hey, it's good to see you." Uh, and they often responded, "Hey, it's good to see you too." They didn't say, "Oh, Dr. Grangard, it's great to hear your voice." Or worse yet, they didn't say, "Yeah, I smelled you coming." There's a tendency for vision to dominate the other four senses, which is kind of interesting. Uh, in the next unit, we'll talk about dreams and states of consciousness. And one of the things that we will talk about are the dreams of visually impaired individuals, including those who have been blind since birth. Now, one of the things that is mentioned in the video is the concept of the absolute threshold. And let's take a look at the next slide. The absolute threshold is the minimal amount of stimuli necessary to detect something half the time. The minimal amount of stimulation necessary to detect a stimulus half the time. And so for vision, it was the light of a candle on a dark night from like 30 miles away. If you can imagine being able to see a candle burning down in San Marcos, is about 30 miles from Austin on a dark, clear night. That would be the absolute threshold for vision. For taste, it was 1 teaspoon of sugar in 2 gallons of water. For smell, it was a drop of perfume in a 3-room apartment. For touch, the wing of a bee landing on your cheek from a distance of 1 centimeter. And for sound, it was the ticking of a watch from a distance of 20 feet. So that is the absolute threshold. And what the absolute threshold is again, the minimal amount of stimuli necessary to detect it half the time. So the question I have for you is, what exactly is a subliminal stimulus, and can it affect us either adversely or positively? In other words, a subliminal stimuli, if you look at this graph, is something that falls below the absolute threshold. In other words, would a light that is further away than 30 miles on a dark, clear night, would that affect you in some way? Or the ticking of a watch. Let's say you're in a basketball arena and you're at the far end of the court. Would you hear somebody's watch ticking on the other end of the arena or something like that? It would be, in other words, below the absolute threshold. It would be a greater distance than the one that was talked about. Could that adversely affect you? What really got this whole concept heated up was the suggestion, this is back in like the late 1950s, early 1960s, that people were being exposed to subliminal stimuli. In other words, stimuli that fall below the absolute threshold, and it was causing them to do things that they wouldn't normally do. For example, if they were in a movie theater, a message would be flashed on the screen faster than you could even detect it. Something like eat popcorn or drink Coca-Cola. And although they couldn't see the message, they suddenly found themselves wanting to go buy popcorn or buy a Coca-Cola. Um, could this really affect you? Now you say, yeah, I went to the movies the other day and I ended up buying a Coke and getting some popcorn. Well, there was nothing subliminal about that. When you see dancing Coca-Cola cups on the movie screen before the main feature starts, or when you walk into the theater and you smell the popcorn popping, there's nothing subliminal about that. It's not that you can't detect those sensations, but things that you can't see and hear and taste and so on, can they really adversely affect you in some way? This whole issue really got heated up about the time I moved to Austin uh, in the late 1970s, when it was suggested that rock and roll records had satanic messages subliminally uh, embedded in them. And although they weren't evident in the lyrics themselves, these subliminal messages were in there to motivate people to do bad things. And supposedly, if you were able to play the record, I'm talking about LPs, which are making a comeback these days, that if you could play the LP backwards, you would actually hear these satanic and evil messages. Um, and you've probably heard the joke about what happens when you play a country and western record backwards. You get your dog back, you get your wife back, you get your kids back, and all that kind of thing. Um, so there were these record burnings going on around Austin and other cities. People were told to bring these records, and people were smashing them in to pieces and throwing them into bonfires and all this kind of stuff because they had these subliminal satanic messages embedded in them. We don't have to worry about that today. Of course, a lot of things that you might hear on the radio or even buy. There's nothing subliminal about it. The messages are just right there. You can hear them. It's not that it's going against your will with some silent thing. Can this really happen? Something I always like to do when I'm teaching this course in class is on test days, I would have students take tests on Scantron forms, and then um, they had their test booklet with the questions, and then their Scantron form, which they filled the answers in. And I would have a Scantron form with all the answers already filled in that I used to feed into a machine to grade the test. And what I would do is I would quickly, as fast as you could see me move, uh, say, "Oh, here's all the answers." If I flashed a message like that faster than they could see it, would it subliminally give them all the answers? Apparently not. There was some studies done in Canada, and this is before the days of, like we have now with cell phones and so on. You probably get these surveys that maybe even in a course like this, you can tune into a certain channel and click your answers to things. But if you go way back, there was a study done in Canada where a subliminal message was going to be flashed during a television program, And the people watching it were supposed to, on 3x5 postcards, jot down the message that was given to them. And hundreds of these postcards were sent in by people who said they received various subliminal messages. uh, and the postcards that were sent in said things like drink Coca-Cola and that sort of thing. Absolutely nobody sent in what the subliminal message actually was. In other words, this message that was flashed on the screen faster than someone could see it. And the message was telephone now. So the research on subliminal stimuli is not very impressive. Whether that it could affect you negatively or positively. Uh, Back around the same time, it was suggested that subliminally you could uh, put a recording in before you went to bed of, let's say something like learning a foreign language, and that, even though you're not attending to the task at hand, you would wake up in the morning doing pretty well in your studies of this foreign language. What I would say to you is, don't worry about going to the grocery store and that they're broadcasting a message you can't even hear, and it's going to motivate you to buy something you didn't intend to buy at the store. That's not going to happen. If you can't hear it, it's not going to affect you. On the other hand, you can't listen to this recording that I'm showing you right now while you're asleep tonight and wake up in the morning and know all the information inside and out. That's not going to happen either. Now, your textbook suggests, and I disagree with your textbook author on this, they suggest that people can be affected by subliminal stimuli, but their idea of a subliminal stimuli doesn't really fit the definition of something that falls below the absolute threshold in this area shown on the graph, the light blue area on the graph. Uh, there, what your textbook is suggesting is more of a guilt by association, as they showed in the video clip at Stanford. uh, the rat man uh, phenomenon, where they showed subjects pictures of animals, pen and ink drawings of animals, 4 or 5 in a row, and then they showed this one particular uh, picture that people tended to identify as a rat. When they showed people, on the other hand, pen and ink drawings of people's faces, and then they showed that same drawing, people would identify that as an old man with glasses. So, you're kind of primed to see what you're planning on seeing. That isn't subliminal stimulation. You really can't be adversely or positively affected by something that falls below the absolute threshold. And unconsciously associating things, that's not subliminal. that may be a form of perception. It may be your brain's interpretation of the stimuli, but it's not really a subliminal stimuli. Um, so, I would differ with Dr. Myers and his co-authors on that point. I want to now show you a video clip that's from a movie that's absolutely hilarious. It's basically this, that aliens have taken over the Earth and they are in control, and they control all of us via subliminal messages. And there's this guy who has these special sunglasses, and by putting on his sunglasses, he is able to detect these subliminal messages that everyone else isn't aware of, but they are affecting them. They are controlling them. They are unable to have independent thought and that sort of thing. Let me show you this video clip. If this doesn't work, you can watch. There's also a link to it on Blackboard. Okay, so it doesn't work. Well, you can watch the link on Blackboard. Uh, what's interesting um, about this is, for instance, the guy looks up at this billboard, and there's this attractive woman in a bikini on the beach. But the subliminal message that he's able to read when he puts his sunglasses on is marry and reproduce. Or he's talking to this guy at this newsstand who's got a handful of bills, dollar bills and fives and tens and so on. But when he looks at the money with his sunglasses on, it basically says, "This is your God. This is what you worship as money," and so on. You've got to watch the clip. I think it's hilarious. And by wearing these sunglasses, he is able to detect who the aliens actually are, uh, and how they're controlling everything. In fact, if he's walking down the street, there are loudspeakers that are saying, telling him to sleep, no independent thought, uh, watch TV, all this kind of stuff. So be sure and watch the clip. It's hilarious. Subliminal stimulation. Don't worry about it. Let's talk a little bit more about the eye. And you might remember from the discussion in the video that when you look at something in the distance, that's what's known as the distal stimulus. Light reflecting off of the distal stimulus goes to the eye. It goes through the pupil, which is that kind of, it's really like a hole in the eye, the size of which is controlled by the iris, which is the colored part of the eye. So it passes through the pupil, which is controlled by the iris. It goes through the lens and then hopefully is focused on the retina, which is made up of rods and cones and is on the back of the eye. Actually, it's all around the inside of the eye. Rods give us night vision. Cones give us color vision and clarity in vision. And cones are most densely packed in an area just above the optic nerve that's known as the fovea. The fovea only contains cones. The rods are located more on the periphery of the retina, and the rods contain a chemical called rhodopsin. Rhodopsin is a jello-like substance. You know, when you make jello, it starts out as a liquid, and then you put it in the refrigerator, and then after a period of time, it gels out. This is what happens with the rhodopsin in the rods. When you first go to bed at night, for example, and you turn out all the lights in the room, you can't really see anything. But once the rhodopsin in the rods gels out, let's say you wake up in the middle of the night, you can see almost as well as you can in the light. It takes about 20 minutes for the rhodopsin in the rods to gel out. Now, also when you turn out the light, in order to let more light in through the lens, the iris will expand so that light can stimulate the rods that are located on the periphery of the retina. Of course, if you wake up in the middle of the night, let's say you go to the bathroom, you turn the light on, it kind of burns your eyes, doesn't it? But within a second or two, you can see well. And that's because, although it takes about 20 minutes for the rhodopsin in the rods to gel out, it breaks back down into its liquid state within a fraction of a second or two. And of course, the iris, once exposed to light, immediately contracts to make the opening smaller so that it doesn't hurt so bad. Remember also that it talked in the video about that the light from the distal stimulus, once it passes through the lens and lands on the retina, is actually inverted. It's like upside down, turned around, it's full of holes, but it's your brain, it's the occipital lobe in particular of your brain that instantly and continually corrects the sensations that are going on. And so it turns the distal stimulus, and when it hits the retina, now it's known as the proximal stimulus. And so the proximal stimulus is immediately turned right side up, all the holes are filled in, and so on. Well, that's the way it's supposed to work, but some of us are nearsighted. We suffer from myopia, or we're farsighted and we suffer from hyperopia. And in the case of myopia, instead of the light from the distal stimulus landing on the retina, it appears as if it's landing in front of the retina, and consequently if you have Nearsightedness, you can see things up close easily, but it's hard to read things in the distance. For example, in the classroom, you might have no difficulty reading a book, but even if you're sitting on the front row, and for sure if you're on the back row, it's hard to see anything that's written on the whiteboard or the chalkboard, depending on the makeup of the classroom. On the other hand, if you're farsighted, you might not have any difficulty reading information written on the board in the classroom, but when you go to read independently, or if you were called on to read something out loud, you might have difficulty seeing the printed information on the page I'm sorry, because what you're looking at, although it should be focused on the retina, it appears as if it's focused behind the retina. The fovea I mentioned before contains only cones, and cones give us clarity in vision. And so, what's kind of interesting is, uh, let's say you're nearsighted, like I am, and you're seated, well, maybe you're on the front row of the classroom, but you still can't make out what's on the board very well. Or maybe there's a slide like you're looking at right now that's projected on the board, but some of the words are hard to see. If you create a telescope-like thing where you just create a pinhole of light and focus that pinhole on, let's say, one of those words, it forces the light from the distal stimulus, which is what's on the board, through your lens directly into the fovea. And again, the fovea gives you clarity in vision. And you'll be able to see as well as you could with your glasses on. Of course, your peripheral vision wouldn't be very good, and so you wouldn't be able to see things that are off to the sides. Another thing I want to mention here, though, is Gestalt principles of grouping. That when we look at something according to what are known as Gestalt psychologists, and Gestalt is a German word meaning whole, and the main principle of the Gestalt psychologist is this, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. When we look at something, we try to get the big picture. For instance, this is my cell phone, and it's a smartphone, it's an iPhone. Um, it can do all kinds of things, everything from make a phone call with it to I can log on to the internet and look things up. I can find out the weather. I mean, it's. I can record lectures. I can do all sorts of things. But if we were to take this cell phone apart and lay the parts out all over a table in front of us, each of those parts would be pretty worthless. But if we put them all together and create a smartphone, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And so, according to Gestalt psychologists, when we look at things, we like to try and get the whole picture. And so they have these principles of grouping. For example, see this figure? It's a series of dotted lines. What is that? You look at it and you say, well, it's a triangle. Yeah, it's shaped like a triangle, um, but it's actually a series of dotted lines. But our brain wants to connect all the dashes and call it a triangle. We try to get the big picture. Another principle of grouping uh, is proximity. We tend to group together things that are close to each other, uh, and also things that are similar to each other. So, let's say you're a UT football fan and you got a ticket to an away game, and you know you don't have an assigned seat. It's just kind of general admission ticket, and you want to sit with all the other UT fans. What are you going to look for? A big group of people wearing burnt orange, right? That's what you would do, because we would tend to group them all together because they're dressed similarly, they look similar. Well, what if there's a person sitting in the group who doesn't have on burnt orange? Well, you'd still probably, to get the big picture, link that person in with everyone wearing burnt orange just because they were in close proximity to all the folks who had on orange. And you might assume they're also a UT fan. Their orange shirt was in the wash. Okay? So when we look at things, we try to get the big picture. And consequently, a lot of times we don't see things if we're not looking for those things. For example, have you ever gone somewhere and run into somebody you weren't planning on seeing, and maybe you recognize them, but they didn't even notice you because they weren't planning on seeing you there? We often don't see things if we're not looking for it. I'll never forget, I had a roommate in college who was from Austin, and I used to play a lot of golf with him. He still lived in Waco, but I had moved to Austin after we had graduated. And I used to, his parents lived in Austin, and I used to, whenever he came to town, I would play golf with my old roommate and his father. So anyway, one day I was driving down my car down Red River Street, uh, past the Hancock golf course there on 38th and, or might be 35th. No, I think it is 38th and Red River anyway. Um, and I was driving by the golf course and I was thinking about my old roommate and his dad and how much I enjoyed playing golf with them. And I stopped at the red light there on the corner, and I looked over to my left, and there was my old roommate in town in the car with his dad. And I honked and waved, and they kind of ignored me and acted like they had never seen me before. And, who is this weirdo? I recognize them because I was just thinking about them, but I was the last thing on their mind. It was so funny. It was like they were kind of ignoring me, like I was some kind of a weirdo that was trying to get their attention or something. So we often don't even see things that we're not looking for. The last thing I want to mention here is what about extrasensory perception? ESP. This is stuff like telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, deja vu. In other words, can you have perception in the absence of stimulation? Telepathy is a mind to mind communication. Um, well, some people who've been friends a long time or couples that have been together for a long time often know what each other are thinking. Um, and but it also gets into mind reading. A clairvoyance has to do with experiencing events that are happening remotely. If you're a Star Wars fan, in the what's known as the fourth episode, A New Hope, there's there's one scene where a planet is destroyed by this Death Star, and Obi-Wan Kenobi is on the Millennial Falcon, and all of a sudden he goes, "Oh, there's a disturbance in the Force. I feel like something terrible has happened." Even though he wasn't where this planet was that was destroyed, he experienced it. Sometimes you hear stories about um, identical twins, for example, who maybe are separated, living in different cities, and all of a sudden one of the individuals just has this feeling that something's happened to their twin. And they might get their cell phone out and call them up, and yeah, sure enough, they were just in a fender bender or something. But they experience this remotely. Um, and then the precognition thing is being able to foresee the future, making predictions about things. There were astrologers, for example, who claimed they had predicted President Kennedy's assassination back in 1963. Well, anybody could predict the assassination of some public figure like that. Somebody's always out to get them. And then when it happens, say, "See, I predicted it." I used to like to tease students during this lecture and say, "I have this ability. In fact, I predict uh, when class ends at noon, all of you are going to walk out of the room." uh, Deja vu. Have you ever had deja vu experiences? That's where you feel like this happened before. I feel like I've been in this situation before, and this is I'm re-experiencing it. But so and so walked in the room, and then all of a sudden, so and so walks in the room, and you're like, "Whoa, this is really weird." Are these things possible? Having ESP. years ago when I had a private practice, there was a psychiatrist in town who started sending me many, many referrals to do comprehensive psychological evaluations of his patients. Yeah, he was sending me, like maybe two people a week. That's a lot of business. And after a month or so, I called him up and I said, "Hey, uh, we need to meet. You know, I'd like to take you to lunch." And he said, "Great." And we agreed to meet at this one particular restaurant that we both liked. And one of the first things he told me was that he had telepathy, that he could read minds. And I remember thinking, well, if you do have telepathy, then I think you're full of it. But if he could read my mind, he continued to send me referrals anyway. So, do these things exist? Well, the research on them is not very impressive. Things like telepathy, reading minds, they've had these experiments where, they get a deck of cards and then, pick out one card and, the person picks out a card and looks at it and then they, okay, you're looking at the card. I'm going to read your mind and tell you what card you're looking at without looking at the rest of the deck. Well, they have a 1 in 52 chance of getting it right, but um, these experiments aren't very impressive. Uh, in fact, some research would suggest the ability, for example, to know where a victim of a crime is buried. These people have never really been very helpful to police departments. People claiming to have these ESP abilities. I think they do exist. I would question people who claim that they can call them into play anytime they want. But perhaps you've had some of these clairvoyant experiences or something like that. I like to mention one deja vu experience I had years ago. I was working as a school psychologist for the Austin Independent School District. And one day I walked into the office. I was out in the schools every day, except on Thursdays we had meetings in our office. And so I walked into the office. It was a Thursday afternoon when we have our meetings. And as I walked in the building, this thought came into my head that Tom Oakland is going to call you on Tom Oakland was going to call me on the telephone. Tom Oakland was a very well known professor of school psychology at the University of Texas. I had attended some workshops that he had done, but he didn't know me from Adam. And why would I walk into the building and think Tom Oakland's going to call me on the phone? So anyway, I walked into my office and the phone buzzed and I picked it up and my secretary said, Tom Oakland's on line one. I'm like, oh, are you kidding me? And so I picked up the phone and, hello, Tom. Uh, and first words out of his mouth were, have we ever met? I said, well, not officially. I've been at some workshops and seminars and things that you've done. Um, but we haven't. He seemed to be in the dark as to why he had called me. And he was inviting me to be a guest speaker at his tests and measurements class that he taught at the University of Texas. But why he called me to be a guest speaker when he didn't really know me, it's like he was in the dark. I was shocked that he had called me and invited me. It's like deja vu. I don't know how else to look at it. So, there's some weird things that happen. But I don't think you can make them happen. But some of us certainly have experienced extrasensory perceptions. I just question people that say they can make them happen. Well, that's the end of this little lecture. Um, we should really have fun with the next topic after you're done with this one, which gets into my own personal favorite topic, and that is states of consciousness, and that includes all about sleep and dreams and that sort of thing.